Hey everyone, welcome back. So I recently did a poll to see what video you all wanted to see next, and you all voted for tips for beginning your witchcraft practice, which is, as you can see by the title, what we're going to be talking about today. So as always, a little bit of a disclaimer, I am not a professional witch. This is just from my point of view and things that I have kind of put together of things that I wish that I knew at the beginning of my witchcraft practice. Be sure to always cross-reference and recognize that your path and the way that you do things is probably going to be different. These are just things that I kind of wish that I knew, what I've learned along my way. Before we dive in, I do want to announce something really exciting. So a few weeks ago, I was talking about on my Patreon a passion project, and I kind of told you all about these potions that I have crafted when I first opened up my shop, which was previously known as Witchbish Apothecary, which I opened like 2 or so years ago. In that shop, I had offered some coffee syrups, some potions, and they sold really well. You all gave me a lot of feedback, really loved the syrup that I made. Ever since I kind of stopped making the syrups, I was really sad. I really do enjoy them, especially someone who has experience within the coffee industry and has for quite some time now. At the beginning of the year, I was, new year, 2022, like what are we gonna do? And I kept thinking about those syrups and just like where I wanted to take my shop. What do I want to do? And I obviously posted on Patreon, like, if I were to bring my coffee syrups back, would you all be interested? And a lot of you responded, and I just want to say I'm super grateful for everyone who reached out and was like, yes, I would absolutely love that. I think this is a great idea. And so shout out to my friends too who have like helped me brainstorm this. Eventually, thus birthed Folkcraft Goods. So Folkcraft Goods is coffee potions, tea blends, and more. And so I'm really excited to dive into the first steps of a much bigger dream of mine, and I'm very excited. So be sure to keep on a lookout. I will be sure to post some updates in terms of what potions, coffee syrups are going to be offered, and Patreon will know these before anybody else, so be sure to join our little community where I share spells and tarot readings. And if you are wanting a tarot reading by me, Patreon is going to be the only place where I will now be offering them. So if that is of interest to you, I also talk a little bit about some folk magic and just sharing some resources that I find along the way. So again, these tips and advice that I'm going to share with you all is just something from my personal perspective and isn't like concrete or set in stone. So the first tip that I want to talk about is essentially to do some research about the different magical practices with respect. This includes practices such as Wicca or ceremonial magic practices like Thelema, or traditional witchcraft practices, or even folk practices like hoodoo. Doing research about these different magical practices is important for a number of things. One, it gives you a familiarity of what each practice entails, what their beliefs are. Researching practices is important to give you a better understanding of where certain elements of practices come from and originate. This is also helpful, especially if you are a white practitioner such as myself, to understand practices that are closed and why they are closed. So for example, if I read a book about voodoo, that doesn't mean that I am practicing voodoo. That is me just doing research to understand that magical practice and why it is closed and the beliefs that they have. There's nothing wrong with reading about it. I think a lot of the times we get kind of scared because we don't want to do anything wrong, and I just want to go ahead and clarify that reading about them is not anything wrong. If anything, it is going to help you understand and respect those practices. As you read about these different magical practices, it'll give you a better understanding too of what resonates with you more. So for example, if you start reading about ceremonial magic and the rituals that they all entail, if that's something that doesn't quite align with you or feel like you can devote your time to, then it may not be the path for you. If you start to do research of like the traditional witchcraft, perhaps this is a practice that is for you and you know that it's open. You can also understand the magical practices that require traditionally initiation. These things simply just get you a better basic foundation and understanding of all of the practices that are available, and if there are any sort of initiations that you need to do in order to essentially practice the specific religion or magical practice that you are interested in. Now, for me personally, I started off just reading about all of the different magical practices that are available, and what resonated with me was more of the traditional witchcraft path, and also focusing on the folk practices of the regions of which my family came from. So again, all of your paths are going to be different. There's no right or wrong way. So the next tip that I'm going to provide probably seems a little bit like, well, duh, but I kind of feel like this is, you know, worth talking about. But think about your own personal values. So ask yourself some questions. What do you currently believe in? What are you unsure about? And what are you curious about? And also, what are you passionate about? This will often lead to a path that is more personally aligned with you based on your beliefs and values. Now, you won't have all the answers right away. Perhaps this is something that you need to really think about. It will require some self-reflection, maybe some personal growth. And I just want to reassure you that even as you go along your path, these things will always be questions that you will have. And I personally like to kind of think through my values and my personal beliefs and redefining what magic means to me. You know, why do I choose to practice? You know, whether it is to get closer to my family or to make positive change in my life. These are just questions that you should be asking yourself so that you can be on a path that is going to help you and is going to be more authentic to you personally. Define your intentions. Why are you deciding to practice witchcraft? Is it to get closer to your ancestors? Is it to do some, you know, personal growth and self-discovery? These obviously answers will most likely change as you grow in your practice as well. And so I think that's a great opportunity to always kind of do some self-reflection, continue to ask yourself questions. Why are you practicing this way? Why do you want to use this tool in your practice? So on and so forth. The next piece of advice is to discover your ancestry. So this is a really great starting point because I think that it's helpful to understand where your personal family comes from, so that also you are kind of like not dipping your toe into other practices that perhaps you found out about in the beginning stages of your research. So this was my personal first step, was researching more about my family, which I have talked about plenty of times on my channel and other social media platforms. Researching your own family can reassure you that you are following along a path of where your family came from, and you can start learning more about where they lived, the history, the folklore behind it, and perhaps even traditions that they had. You can continue on into your own path and integrate into your magical practice. However, I understand that if you are an individual of the BIPOC community, this may be really difficult to do because a lot of the information of these individuals were lost. And even if you were to do like a DNA test, I know that a lot of the data isn't even collected. So this is where you can, you know, you don't always have to go along the like whole DNA thing, because I understand like some people are even like weird about that. But you can also start talking to like your friend, sorry, not your friends, but you can talk to like your family members that you actually feel comfortable talking to. And then kind of also researching like last names as well that you may know of, like cousins or aunts, uncles, grandparents, and kind of finding your way around like what regions they may have been from. This is a good example of how I went about my research, is that it led me to finding that I have family from the Appalachian Mountains on my dad's side, Kentucky, Tennessee, North Carolina, South Carolina, and they came from Scotland and England. So Backwoods Witchcraft is about the folk magic in the Appalachian Mountains. Then it also brought me to this book, the Book of English Magic, really again focusing on the folk practices and like folk magic within the areas that my dad's side, that I found from my dad's side. which I've talked a lot about and was a huge reason of why I decided to visit Scotland when my husband and I went to visit family in England last year. So as you kind of like get an idea of your own family, you can kind of figure out like what magical practices if they were to practice, what kind of magical practices would they be doing? What traditions would they have? And allowing that to take you into the rabbit hole. So the next tip that I want to offer is kind of like a new tip that has surfaced based on just like the power of social media, and that is to not define your practice. I think a lot of the times when we start our practices, we want to kind of define ourselves, and I think that social media had a huge impact on that. Just kind of like, what kind of witch are you? And so you hear things like, well, I'm a kitchen witch, or I'm a green witch. I don't feel like you have to pick a title like that, just because you don't want to put yourself in a box. Putting yourself in a box kind of prevents you from exploring different things and really challenging yourself in your practice. I don't think there's anything wrong with, obviously laying down that foundation. Maybe a lot of your spells that you do are within the kitchen. I think sometimes when we want to call ourselves like a kitchen witch, we feel like maybe, oh, well, I can't do anything in terms with, divination, or, it's just strictly in the kitchen. That doesn't have to be the case. So I just want to go ahead and say, like, relieve that pressure of trying to find, like, some sort of cool title to put in your bio. So the next tip that I'm going to share with you is a personal favorite, but it's to keep a journal. Write everything down. I know it can be a struggle, especially if you're not someone who enjoys to write. Maybe even type. Like keep a like Google Doc or whatever for for your practice, something safe, somewhere safe, obviously. But I personally like to write everything down, and this is because it'll be really beneficial for you to kind of like go back and not only to witness your personal growth, but also to like make connections among like your experiences that you have along the way. I also like to keep records of like research that I find, where I find them. I also like to, again, use the journal as a way of self-reflection. So when I am going about my research and reflecting, if I find like a definition of a certain like word, I will redefine it in my own words for me to essentially integrate into my brain. It's just like how I personally study. Think about like how you study in school, I wasn't the best student. I wasn't terrible, but I wasn't the best student. So that's why, like when I do research, I'm pretty slow at it, because it takes a while for me to like really integrate the information that I am digesting. So kind of think about also, this is just a little tip, think about, again, like how you studied in school. Do you learn better by doing? Do you learn better by seeing someone do it? Do you do better by reading? Things like that. Like really think about like your learning style. But keeping a journal is really beneficial, especially as you kind of reflect back on how far you've come, which is really cool. But also just to like keep records of things that you've tried, things that didn't work, and kind of like use it as like formulas, like if you are trying to think of a prosperity spell, use that journal as a way to work through it. The why, the how, the when, all of it, the who's involved, the what's involved, what tools are you going to be using. And then if you do that working and perhaps something manifests itself in your life, that is something that works for you, and you can either take it into like another book, perhaps that's like maybe something that is use as like all of your spells that work, like a grimoire, and then just use this journal as like whatever you want to include along in your practice. I just think it's going to be so beneficial for you to like look back on. I did not keep records of everything when I first started researching, and that I think really hurt me, because I found myself like trying to redefine, and like I wasn't quite like grasping, and that was because I wasn't spending time to actually reflect what everything meant to me personally, and also where I found that information. So like I would go back and read something and I'm like, wait, I've already read this. So take it from someone who learned the hard way. Keep a journal. So for the most part, I think those are some of the biggest tips that I can provide. I know a lot of the times like you will hear like do your research. So let me provide another little mini tip for you all in terms of like, okay, what does that mean? So let's say that you read a book, you loved it. For example, I finished this last month, The Crooked Path, which is about an introduction to traditional witchcraft. So what I would then do after reading this book is I would go back to the bibliography. And so what this is the list of resources that the writer took from and kind of, you know, the research that they've done. So this is a great opportunity to kind of go back and see what books that they listed, what articles that they listed, to dive into a little bit more of what traditional witchcraft is and if it's the path for you. For me personally, I really liked this book. I will be doing a book review on it on my Patreon, so keep an eye out for that. If you're part of Patreon, it's coming, I promise. But if you're not part of Patreon, I will be posting it to YouTube about a week or so later. So if you're interested to know a little bit more about my thoughts of this book, be sure to join Patreon. Another little mini tip that I want to include is because again, I do see this a lot on social media, and even I would even say like I fell into that hole of feeling like you need to buy a lot of material and tools. So for example, my practice is more folk-based practice of the traditions of Britain. So you will find that a lot of practitioners use what was available to them. And I think like now we see a lot of like pretty tools online. I will show you an example. This is a great example of something that I did not need. I don't need this to perform any sort of, to do any sort of witchcraft. It is a tool that I decided to get when I was out and about getting some more candles, but it's not a need. And so I think that a lot of the times when we see a cool tool that we've seen others use, like we think that we need it in order to practice, but that's not always the case. In folk practices, they use what was available to them. They use things like hairs, fingernails, like nails, you know, like that they would nail into the wall, like hair, urine. They would use things that they already had. So there are probably already herbs and spices in your cabinets. There are things, you know, if you need a cloth, like, and you have an old t-shirt, use that. It's really cool what you can get creative with. I think you will surprise yourself how creative you can get, and just keep an open mind as well. And I think that's kind of like, for me personally, that's the fun part of constructing a spell. If I don't have something that I like wish I had, for example, like I wish that I had like a compact like mirror that had like 2 mirrors, you know, but I didn't have that. So for this spell, I needed something that was reflective, and I used foil because my dear friend Ella was like, hey, just use some foil. And I was like, oh, genius, I have that in my kitchen. So those are the tips that I have to kind of provide in terms of starting your witchcraft practice. I know that it's super overwhelming. It seems like any time that you open the door, all of this information floods in, and it's quite scary, or not scary, I would say like overwhelming. But the best piece of advice that I can give is to just take your time. Your path is going to change as you change, because again, you're going to be asking yourself questions of like to define your values, your beliefs, and when you really start to think about those things and why you're practicing, and the purpose of like your practice and what you are doing is ultimately going to define your practice that is authentic to your path. Especially if you are starting to research where your family was from and the traditions of where they are, it's going to look different from someone else's. Just a piece of advice, stay honest with yourself, ask yourself these questions, and follow the rabbit hole. So as you go along your research, let me know in the comments if there's any, you know, what your favorite book that you've read so far, what you're researching now. If you have questions or need recommendations for something specific, like please let me know. I am happy to talk to you about it and answer any questions. And as always, thank you so much for joining me, and I'll see you next time.